Welcome to the Breath of God. My name is Jeff Lewis, and we will continue our study into the life of the Apostle Peter. The title of the study is The Making of an Apostle. So what we're doing is we're walking through the process of how the Lord shaped the Apostle Peter in his early days when he first called him, to when we see the full manifestation of the Lord's character in the life of Peter. And it's like a stepping stone. It starts with faith. The next step is goodness, followed by knowledge, followed by self-control, followed by perseverance, followed by godliness, followed by brotherly kindness, and then finally, love. So we're looking at Peter's life and this process through the lens of the historical books in the New Testament: Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, and the book of Acts. Now, when you look at the Gospels, oftentimes people will get a bit frustrated when they read the Gospels, because the Gospel writers, they write with a theme in mind, not necessarily in exact historical order. So when you look at the Gospels, for example, when you look at Matthew writes from the point of view of fulfillment. Every narrative that he includes in his Gospel, he writes from the lens of fulfillment of the Old Testament prophecies surrounding Messiah. When you look at Mark's Gospel, he wrote that for the Gentile. And he does like snapshots. He's like taking pictures of Jesus through his narrative, demonstrating Jesus' power and Jesus' humility as the Son of God and the servant of all. Now, Luke, when he writes, he's portraying the perfect and lovely humanity of Jesus. So his gospel has narratives in it that the other gospels don't. And then John, when John writes, he has a singular purpose to portray Jesus as God Almighty in the flesh. So when you study these narratives, it's important to understand the author's point of view, why the author wrote these gospels, and what the author is trying to convey. That greatly lessens the frustration when you're reading this, because they don't flow in exact order together. So again, these authors have a point of view. They're delivering a message. They're messengers, and the Bible is a message. So when you get into these Gospels, it's important to understand that what the author is trying to convey. So when we look at Peter's story in the Gospels, we see that there are three events that occur at the very beginning of Peter's journey with Jesus. There's three encounters at the very beginning. In John chapter 1, his encounter with Jesus and his brother Andrew. A second encounter is with the healing that occurs at his house with his mother-in-law. And third is Jesus shows up at Peter's workplace. And this marks the beginning and the emergence of faith in Peter's life. And remember, when you go back to 2 Peter and you look at chapter 1, verse 5, he says, make every effort to add to your faith. So faith is the starting point in the journey. And what we'll look at how faith emerged in Peter's life. So if we go to John's Gospel, and if you go to chapter 1, verses 35 through 42, you have this narrative where John the Baptist is baptizing, and he lets those that are watching and his disciples that Jesus says, "Look, the Lamb of God who takes away the sin of the world." And Andrew, who is a disciple of John the Baptist, goes and follows Jesus in response to John's testimony about Jesus. And Jesus invites Andrew and another disciple to spend some time with him, spend the day. And then after that, Andrew is convinced that Jesus is the Christ. So then he goes and gets his brother Peter, and he brings Peter to Jesus, and Jesus looks at Peter, Simon Peter, and he says, "You are Simon, son of John, and you will be called Cephas," which when translated is Peter. So right away, Jesus sees Simon Peter. It's like he sees a rock that hasn't been sculpted into a piece of artwork yet. And Jesus sees him, what he can become. And he says, "You will be called." So Jesus speaks faith into Peter. And if you remember, faith comes from hearing, and hearing through the word of Christ. So this is, I believe, Peter's first encounter with Jesus is here. And Peter's name, Simon, Shimon, also can be translated as one who hears or heard. So you'll find this often repeated, both in the Old Testament, in the Gospels, and even in Revelation, to hear. Peter's name means to hear. And faith comes from hearing. So Jesus finds his man. He speaks identity right into Peter at that moment, even though Peter himself does not look like the man at the moment that he would ultimately become. Jesus, being God, and this is one of the things I love about the Lord, is he sees the end product of what Simon would become. He sees from this point to the end. Remember, Jesus came in the flesh. He's God. So he sees the beginning, the middle, and the end. In fact, he was there before the beginning and will be there after the end of all things. So he sees, he can operate from an eternal perspective, even though he's in a point in time. And this is amazing. And it's as if Jesus sees Peter, the finished project, and he reaches into eternity, into the future, and beginning to bring forward from the future the Peter that he sees. And in fact, he is also speaking his identity into existence in this moment. And I suspect it was a very interesting moment for Peter. And there's nothing after Jesus just says, "You are Simon, son of John. You will be called Cephas." And that's the end of this encounter. And you get no response from Peter at this point in time. So then we go to Luke's gospel. We find out what may have happened next or around the same time. So when we get to, if we go to Luke chapter 4, verses 38 through 41, and I'm going to read these. Jesus left the synagogue and went to the home of Simon. Now Simon's mother-in-law was suffering from a high fever, and they asked Jesus to help her. So he bent over her and rebuked the fever, and it left her. She got up at once and began to wait on them. So Jesus shows up at Simon's house. His mother-in-law is very ill with a fever. Now at this time, a fever would have been or could have been a death sentence. They didn't have antibiotics like we have today. And his mother-in-law could have been on the verge of death. And you see Jesus come to the home of Simon Peter and heal his mother-in-law, demonstrating his ability and also his care. He spoke identity into him, and then he shows up at his home and heals one who is very important to Peter and Peter's wife. And then an interesting thing happens. We see that people brought all kinds of individuals who were both sick with some kind of physical ailment and those who were demonized and oppressed by evil spirits. And there's an all-night healing and deliverance session at Peter's house. And the amazing thing about this is in the Old Testament, you don't find a single example of a person who is oppressed by an evil spirit being delivered from that evil spirit. Also, what you see in the Old Testament is you see intermittent healing of diseases. But what you see in the ministry of Jesus is actually able to remove the evil spirit that had been oppressing an individual and remove that spirit from them. And he's able to heal all kinds and every kind of disease and sickness. This is not intermittent healing. This is healing of everybody and everything in a moment. And Peter catches a glimpse of Messiah's healing and deliverance ministry. And he experiences it personally with his mother-in-law. And in fact, his mother-in-law is so grateful, she begins to get up and wait on the Lord as he's healing all these people that come all night. So I think the care that Jesus demonstrated towards his mother-in-law probably moved the heart of Peter, on top of the power that he saw that night as everybody came from the region to get healed and delivered. This was a second moment, or I should say encounter with the Lord, that added to the faith bucket. So then we find a little bit further, if we go a little bit further in Luke's gospel, and we go to chapter 5, verses 1 through 11, and you have Luke's saying, one day, as Jesus was standing by the lake of Gennesaret, so one day, the Lord shows up at Peter's place of business. And Peter and his business partners had been up all fishing all night, and they caught nothing at all. And then Jesus says to Peter, put out into deep water and let down your nets for a catch. So I suspect that Jesus was not a stranger to Peter at this point. He had met them with his brother Andrew. He had the healing of his mother-in-law and the all-night healing and deliverance session. And now Jesus comes to Peter's place of employment and he says, the one who spoke identity into you, the one who healed your mother-in-law, the one whom you saw do all the healing and deliverance is now asking you to put out into deep water and let down the nets for a catch. So Simon Peter reluctantly says, Master, we worked hard all night and haven't caught anything. But because you say so, I will let down the nets. When you hear those words from Simon Peter, to me, it sounds like I have had encounters with you. I have had interactions with you. I know you to some degree. I trust you. Although I don't agree with what you're telling me here, I'm going to do it. So immediately, he casts the nets, and there is an immediate catch of fish. And Luke says a large number of fish. Now, typically when fishermen fish, they count the fish. I know I like to fish, and one of the things I always do is count how many I caught. But there were so many fish that the nets began to break and the boats began to sink. And then Simon had to single his business partners, which were James and John, the sons of Zebedee, and to haul in this catch. It was so massive that they had to have their business partners help them. And so they bring in the nets, and then Simon comes up and he says, away from me, Lord, I am a sinful man. He sees the holy God in Jesus. He realizes what kind of man he is. And in fact, he's away from me, Lord. I'm not even worthy to be in your presence. And Jesus says to him, Simon, don't be afraid. From now on, you will catch men. In other words, I called you Peter. I'm going to bring that into a reality. And by the catch of fish, I suspect the catch was so large that when they sold these fish, because they didn't even number them and the boats began to sink and the nets began to break, that the catch was so large that it provided financially for Peter's family while he spent the next 3 to 3.5 years following Jesus all over southern Judea and northern Israel. And it's at this moment that we see faith emerges, it blossoms, it comes forth. And he leaves his nets and he follows Jesus. So that's the first grace, is the emergence of faith. And it took at least 3 encounters that we have here in the Gospels with his brother Andrew, his house, and then at his place of business. And he leaves trusting the Lord. The Lord has, in a way, encountered him. He has seen Jesus. experience His grace and His goodness, and is basically trusting the care of his family and the future of his life to Jesus. And here begins the journey of Peter towards apostleship. Next time, we'll take a look at goodness and how the Lord moves from here to goodness. Not knowledge, goodness. That's the Lord's next step in the process. And that's what Peter said in his epistle. He said, make every effort to add to your faith goodness. So this is where the Lord then begins to work next to bring forth goodness, building on the previous work of faith in Peter's life. So we'll take a look at that, and we'll look at three narratives, three types of ways the Lord cultivated goodness into Peter's life. So faith and then goodness. We can all use faith, and we all need the goodness of Jesus. And that's what I love about this process, is this is where the Lord begins his work, is bringing forth goodness. More people need goodness in their life. They need goodness in their thoughts and their actions. And it's not relative goodness that the Lord brings to Peter, but it's the goodness of Jesus that the Lord imparts into his life. So we'll learn how Jesus brought his goodness and brought forth his goodness out of Peter's life next time. So thank you for listening today at the Breath of God. And remember, his breath is our calling. Thank you for listening. Bye.